Will the human space story, or the human story, continue in space? That is the question that we are going to answer in this next session. Firstly, for those of you who are just joining us, we are here live from VivaTech Stage 3. And the focus of today and the next few days is, of course, tech to watch. Now, will the human story continue in space? Now, it's a tough question. I don't think anyone can actually answer this quite yet, but let's try and do our best with our three guests. Jeremy, who's back with us, of course, and Robert Zubrin, president of the Mars Society. Wow, what a title. He's joining us live from Colorado, USA. Firstly, how are you doing, Robert?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for inviting me.
And thank you for being here with us. I can't wait to hear what you have to say about it all. Now, can you first tell us, just a little introduction, about what the Mars Society is?
Well, the Mars Society is an international organization of people interested in furthering the exploration and ultimately settlement of Mars by both robots and people, by both public and private means. We're in about 40 countries. In France, we're called the Association Planet Mars, but we're all over the world.
Now, you wrote a book called The Case for Mars in 1996, and more recently, The Case for Space in 2019. Now, why do you think we should go to Mars? What is it about this planet that, of course, makes it so attractive for you?
Well, there's three fundamental reasons. It's for the science, for the challenge, and for the future. Mars is the Rosetta Stone for letting us know the truth about the potential prevalence and diversity of life in the universe. Mars is the challenge for today that Apollo was in the 60s. If we take it on, we're going to inspire tens of millions of young people to want to make science their life, because the spirit of youth is the spirit of adventure, and this would basically make it clear that science and not .coms or bitcoins is the great adventure and the future, because if we do what we can do in our time, which is establish the first little human foothold on Mars, then several hundred years from now, there will be new nations on Mars. And not only on Mars, I believe, but on hundreds of planets orbiting stars in this region of the galaxy, because we're going to become spacefarers. And new nations with new languages, new literatures, new thoughts on social organization, innumerable contributions to technology and invention. A civilization as grand in comparison to our global civilization today as ours is in comparison to our condition of origin as a few tribes in the Kenyan Rift Valley. And that is something grand and magnificent. And if you have it in your power to create something grand and magnificent, then you should.
You seem so enthused about it. That's fantastic. Now, we did touch on this briefly with Luca, who we were just talking to in our previous session. I mean, there are obviously a lot of technical challenges if we do, hope to wish to reach Mars. Traveling there, obviously, landing on the surface and returning to Earth. I mean, could you take us through potential technical problems that we could encounter?
Well, certainly there's any number of important technical challenges that need to be resolved to land people on Mars. But I do want to put it in perspective for a minute, in that I believe they are an order of magnitude less relative to our capabilities today, as the technical challenge was to send people to the moon in 1961. And we were there 8 years later. Okay, given a serious situation to do this, there's no question that we could be on Mars in a decade, and in fact, I believe we will. Now, the technical challenges, well, we've already achieved space launch, and our space launch capabilities, in the general sense, are good enough to send people to Mars. If we want to actually settle Mars, we need to greatly reduce the cost of space launch, and this is the task that SpaceX has set for itself and is making, in fact, rapid progress on. They've cut the cost of space launch by a factor of 5 in the past decade by introducing reusability. We need long-duration life support. As the previous speaker said, it takes 6 months to get to Mars. Now, that's the same duration as a typical rotation on the space station. Now, of course, if something goes wrong, you can't just quit as you could in the space station and come down. So we want to make it multiply redundant in order to resolve that. The radiation challenge, an astronaut who spends 6 months on the space station gets half as much cosmic rays as one who would get going to Mars. And so, on one way, and there have been a number of astronauts and cosmonauts who've spent a year on the space station. They've gotten the same radiation dose as they would have gotten on a transit to Mars. We see no radiological casualties, nor actually would we expect any statistically. Now, zero gravity health effects have been quite warned. I believe we should counter this by rotating the spacecraft. Zero gravity is a big kick for astronauts in orbit because it's very novel, but it has bad health effects, and which are difficult to counter even with strenuous exercise programs, although those work to some degree. But rotating the spacecraft, creating artificial gravity, we can resolve that. Then entry and landing on Mars, I mean, we've done it with smaller payloads up to 1 ton, which is the Perseverance rover. We need to have capabilities to land at least 10 tons on Mars, and I think this should be our immediate goal. That is, I think that NASA, ESA should initiate development programs to develop payload systems that can land at least 10 tons, preferably 20 on Mars. Elon Musk's Starship will itself, if it is successful, land 100 tons on Mars. But if we could land 10-ton payloads on Mars, then you can start landing the elements of the human Mars mission.
You just touched on Elon Musk. I mean, you said that we could land on, we could go to Mars in the next 10 years. He says by 2026. I mean, that sounds like tomorrow. I mean, is that a realistic target?
I don't think that's quite a realistic target. Musk tends to be very optimistic in his schedule projections of his developments, but he does eventually come through. 2 years ago, he said Starship would reach orbit in 2020, and it's 2021 and it hasn't. Now he's saying it's going to do it this year. That's questionable, but I think it's a good bet Starship will reach orbit next year. And will be flying regularly to orbit, say, by 2024. And so I don't think they're going to reach Mars with people in 2026, but I do think that it's capable of reaching by the end of the decade. And but I do think that there's more than Starship that's needed to send humans to Mars. There's surface systems, power systems, systems for making the propellant, the return propellant on Mars, because that's the plan. There's carbon dioxide and water on Mars. To refuel the Starship on Mars, you need to turn that into methane and oxygen. Now, we developed, in fact, I have myself developed the technology to do that chemical synthesis, and the science is pretty old. But still, to actually make working systems that will do that at scale reliably on Mars, there's new tests, Mars spaces. There's all sorts of things and that would be difficult for us to develop. A surface nuclear reactor requires highly enriched uranium. I think governments have a role here. I think this should be a public-private partnership. I think we should meet Musk halfway, in which NASA, ESA take responsibility for developing all these other systems. Musk comes through with the transportation system. We got a Mars mission by 2030.
Right. I've just received confirmation that we have Jill Stuart is joining us remotely from the UK. You are a space academic at the London School of Economics. Firstly, Jill, thank you so much for joining us today. Now, I'm not sure if you've been following this session, but we were discussing, of course, space exploration, going to Mars with Robert Zubrin. Now, this all looks like the new Far West. There's a number of questions that come to my mind when, settling into a new planet. But who, in your opinion, would this vast area, or this planet, belong to?
Well, it's a great question. First of all, thanks so much for having me, and I'm glad to have been able to link in this time. I was having technical issues earlier. I wish I was there in Paris with you all, but it's really great to be with you remotely. So I think this is an ethical question, and this is a legal question of who owns celestial territory. And ethically, I think we need to think a bit. You mentioned this being sort of the new West, and people talk about colonialism, colonizing other planets, which is a phrase that I'm uncomfortable with. I think we need to talk more about potentially settling other planets. But there's also a really long history of legal infrastructure that already governs this issue. So technically, no country may lay claim to a celestial territory. I agree with Robert completely that this would probably be done through a public-private partnership. But if you have government agencies involved, they will be bound by this legal infrastructure. And so we're going to need to unpack some of the legislation that governs celestial territory before we get to the point of moving into settlement. But again, I also think we need to think about things like environmental issues. We haven't been that kind to our environment here on Earth. What do we want to do with environments on other planets?
So you mentioned, of course, settlements. I mean, how do you think maybe citizenship would work, for example?
Well, it's actually been speculated upon already. It would follow whatever nationality somebody has on Earth. So when somebody is in space, they remain the citizen of the country that they're from. Where it might get a bit tricky is if we were able to have offspring in space. At the moment, we're a long way from that medically, but there could be analogies. For example, if a baby is born on the high seas, it has the nationality of the ship that it was born on, or if a baby is born in transit in the air. So there are legal analogies, but we haven't really figured that out yet. And so I think it's a bit of push and pull in terms of thinking into the future about how these things will play out, but also then being able to catch up once it actually happens. So I think we need to think into the future, but also be ready to react.
I mean, what if we discover life on Mars? I mean, how could we relate that form of life into, who would the planet belong to if that was the case?
And again, there's this ethical and also legal side to this. I think if we discover life on another planet, that definitely changes our ethical responsibilities for it. We sometimes talk about there being sort of a scale of ethical, moral responsibilities. Does something like the moon, where there is definitely not any life, at least not life that hasn't been brought there by humans, does it have value in and of itself that we should protect it just because it's there? Then what if there's microbial life? And then moving up to the potential of there being sentient life or even intelligent life. And I think we need to think about what our obligations are to these territories according to what sort of life is there, or whether or not they have intrinsic value of their own. Legally, so if there isn't actually a provision for if we discover life somewhere else, does that mean that that life has some sort of legal ownership over a territory? All of our laws still very much reflect they're anthropocentric, they're focused on humans, and so all we have is this main treaty, the Outer Space Treaty of 1967, which says that nobody can claim outer space. It's a little bit tricky because it also says that outer space is the common heritage of mankind. I prefer the phrase humankind now, but it was written in the 1960s. But that also kind of suggests that it belongs to everyone. So it belongs to everyone and no one at the same time.
Now, Robert, I'd just like to ask you a question with regards to what Jill just said. I mean, what is your position on putting a regulatory framework into place? Is it something you'd agree with?
Well, certainly, but the regulatory framework needs to enable private ownership. I mean, the fundamental principle of ethics with regard to ownership is if you create something, you should own it. If someone creates a settlement on Mars, then that settlement and its territory belong to those Martians. That's who owns it. And we do need to, and this is a more immediate question right now, if there was a basis, for instance, for making mining claims based on surveying asteroids, for example, to some specified degree of detail, then we could probably finance asteroid prospecting missions, exploration missions today, based on the speculative value of claims. We don't have the technology today to actually exploit an asteroid mining claim, but people made plenty of money exploring wilderness regions for mining claims long before it was possible to realize those. So we can actually get a lot of privately funded space exploration today if we had a basis for creating claims. And I think we should try to create a sort of an international patent office, as it were. A patent office turns intellectual property into real property, a monetary valued property. And it can do that with inventions. In the case of copyrights, it does it with literary works. And you could do that with the intellectual production of surveying some degree of extraterrestrial territory to a specified degree of detail. We could create a form of mining patent claims, and we would need agreements between nations that they'd be mutually honored.
So an international patent office, Jeremy, what are your views on that?
I think we have to go slowly with this, don't we? Because the sorts of concepts that we're talking about here, we need to go gently and slowly. And I think it's great listening to Robert with what he's got to say about going to Mars and you know, I think being realistic about the deadlines and the challenges, the technical challenges that we have. Going back to what Luca Parmitano was saying earlier, going to the moon and being able to establish our ability to work and function properly there is the stepping stone that everybody that I speak to here in Europe says we need to do first before we move on directly to Mars. Robert might have another view on that. But yeah, when it comes to the rules and regulations, we do need to have rules for these things because otherwise it is chaotic. And it is a question of who's got the most money and who's got the rocket and who can launch it from wherever they like, which could be the case. I mean, basically SpaceX are talking about launching from barges out in the ocean. So who do they need to declare those flights to? If they go to a poorer country and pay them a lot of money and launch from there, who do they need to be responsible to when it comes to that? There are a lot of questions there that need to be answered, and the space world is in the process of kind of realizing these challenges. And realizing that that's soon. You know, at the UN, they've been talking about coming up with new treaties, I don't know, for a couple of decades. Jill would tell us, I think it's 20 years or so, maybe more. And they haven't really got anywhere necessarily. So, yeah, we need to accelerate that process because we need to have a plan.
Absolutely. Now, do you have a question maybe for Robert or Jill?
Yeah, well, I was absolutely kind of gripped by the question of, does Mars belong to the Martians if we find some there? And obviously you can have a debate about that. But I think if you talk to a lot of astrobiologists, they'll say, look, there's probably some slime down there. What is the legal status of slime? And if the slime evolves down the line, was it able to come back and claim that it was being mistreated? I don't know, Jill. Where do we stand on that? What does the space community say?
It's a really good question, and you know, there's a lot of different approaches to this. It's one of the things that I really enjoy thinking about philosophically and reaching out to the public as well to get people's opinions on this. I mean, I think there are two big questions here. Who do we want ultimately to represent us in space? But also this issue of if we come across life elsewhere. Just to confuse things even more, there is a discussion within the community on the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, of which I'm involved in, about how if we were to come across an intelligent species, if they have taken the same trajectory that humans have, there's a good chance that they would be largely robotic. So we're starting to combine our anatomy with technology. And you could feasibly see in the future that we would be more robot than, you know, anatomy. And so if we were to come across a species that was largely or even entirely robotic, does that change our ethical obligations again? That's quite an eccentric niche part of the discussion, but it feeds back into this I think these issues around ethics, philosophy, and law in terms of potentially encountering life on other planets and what our obligations are to foreign celestial environments.
I think the other thing that comes to mind when I'm hearing to these conversations is how, I mean, we're really good here on planet Earth at digging stuff out of the ground and turning it into stuff, or using animals to grow stuff that we can then use, or plants, whatever. So I'm thinking of wood. I'm thinking,
animals.
I've got a nice wool suit here, which a sheep grew for me. I'm surrounded by plastics, which are made from old plants that have been sitting in the ground for millions of years. You don't have necessarily the same set of wealth and resources on the moon. I mean, you might pick up a bit of this, a bit of that, but not necessarily the same things. Have you got the same resources if you go to Mars? Can you get the same wealth of resources? I don't know. Robert maybe have an answer on that one. But
actually, that is actually one of the questions that we've been asked with regards to, did we make any progress on figuring out how to make Mars soil suitable for growing safe food, Robert?
Well, you would have to treat Mars soil to make it suitable for growing food. You could first wash it to destroy the peroxides and remove most of the percolates and so forth. But there's actually a bigger question here, which is really needs to be made clear, which is about the nature of resources. There's no such thing as a natural resource. There's only natural raw materials. It is human creativity that turns materials into resources. Land on Earth was not a resource until we invented agriculture. Oil was not a resource until we invented oil drilling and refining and machines that could run on the product. Until then, oil was just this stuff that leaked out of the ground and ruined your farm. Aluminum was not a resource until the 20th century. People 200 years ago never saw a piece of aluminum. They called it dirt. Uranium, of course, was not a resource until we invented nuclear power. Deuterium is not a resource today. It will be once we develop fusion power. There are no resources on Mars today, but there will be plenty once there are resourceful people there, okay, who can bring the technology and transform Martian materials into resources. And this is a very important point, because you know, the great catastrophes of the 20th century weren't caused by climate change or resource exhaustion. They were caused by the conceit that there's only so much to go around because there's only so much resources in the world, so we got to kill each other to see who's going to get them. Okay, I mean, that's fundamentally at the root of this idea that nations are in a struggle for existence with each other over limited resources. Now, it's a false idea because resources are created once again, by human creativity. There are far more resources in the world today than there were 100 years ago, despite all those that we've used. And the great thing that Mars can do for humanity is refute this conceit. We're not going to bring oil from Mars to Earth. What we can bring from Mars to Earth is a demonstration that there is no point killing ourselves fighting over provinces when we can create livable planets.
But you mentioned climate change and, you know, what we've done to this Earth. You know, to kind of prevent that from happening elsewhere, do you not think we should maybe be a bit more selective as to who can go? I mean, say that, you know, in 10, 15, 20 years' time we do go to Mars. Should we not be a bit more selective on who can go? That's a question for you, Jill.
This is something that I also love to ask people in the public about, because I think it's something that we should have an opinion on. It's interesting because you say to people, do we want, you know, to mainly be countries that are active in space? And people are okay with that. And then you say, well, what if it's China or a country they're not so sure about? Then you say, well, what if it's companies that represent us? And you know, people like SpaceX, so they like Elon Musk, and so they're in favor of that. But then if you mention it being a company like Coca-Cola or something, then people think, oh no, actually I'm not comfortable with the idea of commercialism infiltrating space that much. You know, should it be an intergovernmental organization? Also, in terms of individuals, it's really only the very, very wealthy elite who can access space in a tourist capacity at the moment. And so there are no straightforward answers, but I think having that conversation is really important at things like VivaTech.
Absolutely. What do you think, Jeremy?
No, absolutely right. We have to have that conversation. It was very encouraging, Robert, talking about public-private partnership, because we've seen the power of SpaceX to innovate and accelerate, and things like Starship, that wonderful, wonderful new spacecraft that they've launched is fabulous. But I don't know, do I want the kind of person who would launch a second-hand car into space to be the first one to be sending people to another planet and representing us, as Jill was talking about? So there are conversations to be had. I don't necessarily have any answers. I do know I'd love to go and do space tourism flight, and if anybody's listening and wants to send me up there for a weekend, I'm all up for it, because that is just brilliant. And for me, that's the near future. Mars looks scary. It's cold and hostile. Oh, dear. I'll send Luca Parmitano, and he can just tell me all about it, but I'm not going.
You got 23 million in the bank?
No.
Right, then you won't be going anytime soon. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Thank you, Jill. Thank you so much, Robert. That was a fascinating session.